Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good. Everybody else that may be hearing my voice right now. It is 8:02 a.m. and today we are listening to the Age of Fission radio show. I am your host, Jerome Bear, and today I want to talk about something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, I guess you could say in some ways. We're going to talk about Rocky Flats. I think one of the most ignored and underreported nuclear issues that we have in our country right now. I grew up in Denver, Colorado. My family moved there in April of 1969. I lived there until I was 15, 16 years old and then was living in other places. So I spent my entire childhood in the middle of the Denver metro area, which is right outside of the areas that they stopped testing at for plutonium, and therefore not contaminated according to their idea of what contamination is. And I've always known about it, but I never really thought about it. And until recently, I started really looking into this, and it's like, they lost over 100 pounds of plutonium dust. So fine, it was able to float away in smoke and in other ways over the years from that plant. Think of how big of a pile of little tiny pieces 100 pounds would be. Think of how much that right there is going to impact future generations, and this stuff lasts 24,000 years. So it's just, to me, it is really disastrous for everybody that lives in the Metro Denver area. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that the background radiation in the Metro Denver area is double or more anywhere else I've been in the country and tested with this little Geiger counter. It is by far the highest radiation levels that I've seen. And that includes when I was in an airplane testing radiation levels from cosmic radiation. As high as that. When I left the Denver metro area with a Geiger counter in my pocket, flying on an airplane, the radiation level didn't drop until the plane came down, and then it dropped. So basically, background radiation in the Metro Denver area is the same as the radiation received by pilots in airplanes. And I suggest that all of my listeners, especially if you live in the Metro Denver area, go and check out that. What does that mean? What does it mean, the amount the pilot gets? Well, they can only fly so many hours because they will literally get cancer from cosmic radiation when you're that high off the surface. So that's background. Okay, so they can only fly for so many hours. How long can you stay on the ground? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? And that's from this plant. It is from this plant. You know, they were processing, milling, mining, or not mining, processing, milling, smelting, burning, forming into ingots, pressing, rolling. All of these things is plutonium metal, and that metal, it breaks into tinier and tinier little pieces, and then finally you have dust that's just flying around in there. And I think that's probably part of the problem, is that dust is probably part of the problem that caused fires in the glove boxes, is that too much dust accumulated. And it is pyrophoric, and it just blows into flames. And if you throw any water at it, then it might start to chain react. So at any rate, John Lipsky, he's a former FBI agent for Operation Desert Glow, Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. This individual was the lead, I believe, investigator of that team that went out there, and they had to sneak out there. They went out there under the guise of a security alert drill, and so that they could get all the way in before they announced, no, this is actually a raid. So they literally, this guy was part of that process. I managed to get a hold of this guy, and I have set up a request for an interview, and he has acknowledged that, and we're going to work on getting an actual interview with me asking the questions. What I'm going to play for you today, and this is actually fairly long. This is a 5-part thing. Each part's about 8 minutes. You won't be able to tell the difference. But of this individual, and it's from the Denver Direct channel, and thank you, Denver Direct. It's an in-depth interview with this guy, and they did him and Judy Padilla. This is the other person that talked. He's sitting in the same chair that Judy Padilla, the letter lady that worked at Rocky Flats, was sitting. So we're going to do half of this today, and then we're going to finish the other half tomorrow with commentary from yours truly. So I'm going to start that now, and it may take me a second to get volumes and stuff dialed in. Thank you.
What actually started? I mean, you didn't just wake up one morning and Rocky Flats was aglow out there and say, "Ha, that's my next mission." How did you do that?
Well, before I was an FBI agent, I was a police officer in Las Vegas, Nevada. And when I was assigned to Denver, one of the older agents decided that he didn't want to be the liaison with the EPA. And since I was the new guy, my turn in the barrel, so to speak, I was assigned to be liaison with the EPA, and which entailed this new concept of environmental crimes. What people don't realize is that Earth Day back in 1970 and the Clean Water Act, and then RCRA and all the other statutes really didn't have a criminal bite until the 80s. And that was all being phased in. And the only thing I could justify to myself for this type of work was that I used to write littering tickets as a cop, so I had some environmental background. But that was just, all kidding aside, I believed in protecting the environment, not to litter, those types of issues. And it was like about October of 1984, fresh out of the academy, and I found out that there was a seminar of sorts out in Los Angeles. And I went to my supervisor and asked him to go, and he said, "Well, we don't know if we have the money." And I said, "Bill," his name was Bill, said, "You're going to assign me to do a job, you need to train me." And this is the word complex has no meaning compared to these types of investigations. Complex is nothing compared to working an environmental crimes case, and I'm going to need the training. So I talked my way into it and went. And having the background as a police officer, knowing my beat, so to speak, not just where buildings are, but to know who the people are, what shift they work, what back doors are open at night. That kind of minutia was my style of being a cop. But I also wanted to know who the people were. I wanted to be able to interact with people. I wanted to feel comfortable that they could tell me confidentially or openly. And you could say I work people, and I enjoy working with people. And because of that reason, I saw the need to go out and reach out to the environmentalist here in Colorado. So it wasn't just a matter of getting trained up on how to work these cases, but also I was interested in knowing what the people knew. In other words, pointers. Where could I go and look for things? And of course, the number one item on the list was Rocky Flats. But no one felt that anybody was going to ever be able to pierce that veil, because the Rocky Flats plant was considered a secret place, and a lot of people had been arrested for trespassing, and it was just it was untouchable, basically. And to make that long story short, it was always on the back burner. It was always an idea of sorts. And as I became more educated in the environmental crimes process and who the violators were, I found that the federal government was actually probably the biggest violator of environmental crimes. I put it at 28% in Colorado. And it was in June of 1987, and I got a call from Bill Smith. He was the EPA agent that I worked with, and he wanted to show me something, but he wasn't going to tell me what it was over the phone. So I went out to the Denver Federal Center in Lakewood. How about that for memory? And he had received a copy of the Mary L. Walker briefing memo from his boss. And what had transpired is that the Department of Energy was being looked at by a committee in Congress, and this memo had come up as being turned over to Congress. And it was a very damning memo about the operations at Rocky Flats, and that because of the operations, they were basically running an illegal operation in comparison to what the environmental laws were and the compliance that they were to look at. Now, I've read a lot of things, so, I had sources over at Rocky Flats, and, Jim Stone, God rest his soul, was a big whistleblower and all that stuff, and that's not what it was. The bottom line is the Attorney General guidelines have to be followed, and I needed a predicate reason to be able to investigate this case. And the whims and feelings and dreams of some people in the community was not enough to make it the threshold of being a predicate crime. But the Mary L. Walker briefing memo did. But you have to understand that politics is politics, and we're dealing with a huge political potato. And because of the politics at the time, meaning that a certain Robert Miller was the U.S. attorney at the time, the prosecutor that I worked with decided he wasn't going to approach Mr. Miller about investigating Rocky Flats. So rather than having a full field investigation, I had a preliminary inquiry for over a year. And there was only so much I could do. I was constrained. In other words, I had to pretty much base everything on public record and what have you. But there was quite a record, believe it or not, that had been compiled by the then Colorado Department of Health and the EPA. And because of the delegation of authority being granted to the Colorado Department of Health, a lot of the records that weren't public were over at the CDH office. But we had some EPA people that were very helpful, as well as some Colorado Department of Health. And then, of course, Jim Stone was introduced to me, and quite frankly, I wrote down what he said, as I always did. And in my business, even though they've told me this, once they read what I write, and I wrote what they said, they like to do a 180, waffle, things like that. And but this was an unusual situation because after hearing what Jim Stone had to say, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. 76 pounds of plutonium was trapped in the ductwork, and on and on and on. And it all made sense what he said. You know, the negative ions with the plastic, and the filters were being poked, and you know, things. That's how the plutonium was allowed to escape through. It was a huge puzzle with not all the parts, and it wasn't really clear for a long time. It sometimes isn't clear now what happened. You know, this is 21 years ago almost since the surge. So that's how Rocky Flats came into crosshairs. It was working the cases. It was gaining credibility with the activists, some of the activists, I should say, and law enforcement communities. And it's no other way to put it, but just hoofing it, working hard, getting the job done. And I was very fortunate, but I also felt like I put myself in a position to where these opportunities could happen. But I also know that without one of the U.S. attorneys that I worked with, this case would have never gotten off the ground. I mean, this was a case where that could have easily just been shelved. No, we're not going to touch this.
Can you talk a little bit about the politics of that? What does that mean, the politics of that search?
Oh, my goodness. Well, as I explained earlier with Robert Miller being the U.S. attorney at the time, and Ken Thunberg's assessment was that Mr. Miller was not going to allow an investigation at Rocky Flats because it might hurt jobs, which he has to be sensitive to. So that's somewhat political. Also, we're talking about one executive branch agency going after another. And from my understanding, that had not been done before. And I don't believe it's been done since, where a search warrant was executed by executive branch agency on another. The funding aspects of the Department of Energy were controlled by the military. So the military basically had this weapons need, and I'm sure they didn't want any problem with that. Well, it's the own assessment of the person that wrote the briefing memo for Mariel Walker. Essentially, Rocky Flats could not operate legally. And when EG&G took over from Rockwell after Rockwell got fired, that's exactly what they told then Admiral Watkins, the Department of Energy Secretary. We can't operate this plant legally. And I've been out there, or I was out there, and I've reviewed the paperwork. And that's another political aspect of it. Gee, do you think maybe we could all talk together and work some things out, and maybe we can share some ideas? Oh, no, we don't want to do that. The water people are compartmentalized, and the RCRA people were over here compartmentalized. And because then another political issue was the waste stream identification and characterization report was stamped as UCNI. Unclassified nuclear information, which doesn't have any meaning towards the National Security Act, but then President Reagan came up with this great idea so that now these 29 volumes were kept from the public view, and they were under lock and key at the Colorado Department of Health. So they had them. Did they open them? I don't know. If you were to ask me what I thought, I would say no. They never looked at them, or they just kind of thumbed through it. I mean, these are massive documents. And in fact, they're over at the Front Range Community College now. So if you want to go look at them. But you're talking about the processes of 400 buildings being isolated and analyzed and then assessed and then schematically flow charted out to where everything went. And it took me months to go through that. I remember it taking me a whole week to figure out the methodology and the reasoning why then Rocky Flats manager for DOE decided that their sewage treatment plant was a publicly owned treatment works under Clean Water Act, Title 33. I mean, it took me a week to figure out. It was like a one-page letter. I'm like, it's like he made it fit on paper, but it was all political. This plant had to operate, and it said safety first on the water tower, but it wasn't. It wasn't. And there were restrictions placed on the plant on when they could allow the water to flow. I'm not talking about regular water, I'm talking about the industrial waste that included sanitary, industrial, hazardous, and radioactive waste. This stuff, there was a lot of controls, but they didn't follow it. And they didn't have to follow it because they could control people. They could control access, and they did. Even the EPA people sometimes, and I talked to Nat Mullo, M-I-U-L-L-O, great guy. But he was blindfolded several times. Oh, we're going to take you where you need to go, but from the front door to that point, you're going to be blindfolded, and they did. So it was not just smoke and mirrors, it was a lot of control.
Actually blindfolded?
They actually blindfolded him.
Physically blindfolded?
Yes, and they had to guide him. And then the Ahern Committee, named after the chairman of the committee I believe was Ahern. They went out in 1988, and they walked through a whole dosage area in Building 771, and they weren't told about it. And that's kind of what precipitated the closure of the Building 771 in 88, in October 7th, 1988. So there was a lot of politics, and to get this off the ground was not easy. I mean, I had an agent who happened to be briefed because I was briefing the executive management of the office, come up to me after the briefing and said, "Well, I live out in Arvada. You can't do this. This is going to lower the property values of my home." I mean, even in-house, it was.
And that was in 88?
That was in 88. He was really concerned about that. Everyone's concerned about, themselves.
You think they were concerned in 88? Talk to him this week.
Pardon me?
They listen to him this week.
Why?
They're telling you about property values. That's what the opposition's going to say to our side. Then there could be some truth to that.
Well, that's true. And we all have the ability to make choices, and some of us make good choices, some of us make bad choices, some of us intend to make good choices, and we end up falling flat on our face. I mean, it happened to me, it happened to you, everybody in this room. We can't fault the innocent for what transgressions have occurred in the past, and where we're headed right now is the school children are going to go out and picnic out there where there was a soup of dangerous chemicals that have not been removed completely.
How do you know they haven't been removed?
How do I know they haven't been removed? Well, my first point would be that, as I talked to you earlier, walk around, talk to people. I had a full access badge out of Rocky Flats. And I made it a point to go out to the 130 building probably once a week, even up through January of 1991. So it's over a year after the search. And I just chewed the fat with people. These were the EG&G people that they were health environmentalist types. There was only like maybe 40 on the plant when we hit the place in 89. And then the thing swelled. The workers were almost gone, and now we had 400. I mean, they were bringing out trailers and just to backfill the 130 area. And, walking around talking to people, some people would strike up conversations, and I listened. Interesting stories, because they worked for EG&G and heard stories about Doc Eggerston on the timing of the first nuclear blast down at Trinity. Really interesting stories, and just the fact that he was the scientist that he was, and we just swapped stories. And one day I got grabbed, and one of the workers asked me, "I want to show you something. I'm going to answer your question, but I got to kind of build this up a little bit. I want to show you something. I'm going to answer your question, but I got to kind of build this up a little bit." And he said, "Have you seen any of this?" And there's a bunch of 3-ring binders that had just come in. And it was infrared photographs of overflights at Rocky Flats. And they were dated like August of 1989. Well, I remembered that Ed Goldberg, who was the acting area manager for Rocky Flats, who replaced Earl Whiteman right before the search, had ordered up infrared, and it was MSS photography, multispectral scanning, so it was color. And the point of it was he said, "Look at this. We have above background levels of strontium and cesium." And I said, "Okay, first off, what's above background levels? Because there shouldn't be any." He says, "Well, there has to be some, because over the years we've had above ground testing throughout the world, and with the prevailing winds, just about everywhere has these chemicals." I said, "Okay, so why is this here?" He says, "Well, then you have to understand that strontium-90 and cesium-137 together is indicia of a critical mass." And I knew exactly what he was talking about. That meant that there was a nuclear reaction out there at Rocky Flats. And because I looked it up, the half-life of both those elements is about 30 years. It had to be within a reasonable amount of time. Nasty carcinogens, both of them. And I don't remember if it was just isolated to the plant site itself or off-site, but the fact that I saw the photographs, I saw the charts, and I went to a Department of Justice attorney and talked to him about it, as we did, because we had a task force, and I was told that they weren't interested in anything like that. So that wasn't pursued. And again, that was a political reason, because I believe that in December of 1989, there was a big confab in D.C., and I believe it was agreed that they were going to work out this Rocky Flats case to nothing. And what I didn't realize till later is that the government agreed that there was no physiological harm caused by the operations at Rocky Flats, which isn't true. And that fits why they don't want to know about the strontium and the cesium. So I've reviewed materials over the years about the cleanup, and I don't remember seeing this report mentioned. I've in particular looked up to see if strontium-90 and cesium-137 were constituents that they were looking for to clean up. I don't remember them showing those as a cleanup. So I would say that DOE has either covered it up, or they've altered other reports, and they've buried this particular data, and it's never seen the light of day. And I'll look anybody in the government right in the face, eye to eye, and I'll tell them that they're a liar, because I saw it. I know it exists.
It still poses a threat today.
Well, I'm not that kind of a scientist. I'm a police scientist, but I'm not a chemical engineer. But I can give you my common sense, and I say yes, it's still a threat, because we're not just talking about the half-life being 30 years. You've still got to project it out over quite a few more decades before it's. And who knows? I mean, no scientist has told us what the acceptable levels are out of working with radionuclides. This is man-made, and for them to define what we can tolerate and what we can't tolerate, I haven't seen it. I mean, even watching documentaries about the first guy that came up with the levels of tolerance for radionuclides, he changed it. He got fired by the government because he wanted to make it tighter, and the government doesn't want to make it tighter. Government they want to call it clean nuclear, just like the Obama administration. I couldn't believe it. He gave an $8 billion loan to Georgia to build a nuclear plant. What is he doing? It's not clean. It's not clean. And making nuclear weapons is not clean. It hasn't been. It never has been. That's why there's national security to shroud the operations so that no one knows what's going on or how dirty it is. So right there, you've got cesium 137, which you can ingest, and it can take 10, 20, or 30 years before you actually get cancer. So it's not instant. And then you've got the bone seeker, strontium 90, that's going to go after you like plutonium does. And the second reason I believe that it's not inhabitable, and I even feel bad about the animals going out there, because they can brush up against this stuff and move it. They're burrowing. Some of the animals are burrowers, so they're putting it down into the ground. Is because I did the overflights over Rocky Flats during the shutdown, and the public was told that a lot of things weren't happening that were. And actually, I have a video for you. This video was the video that we shot back in December, on December 15th, 1988. It sat in a safe until about 2005, when it was used as a plaintiff's exhibit in a local federal civil trial. And so now it's public. But no one has gotten a copy of it and said, see, this is what we were talking about 20 years ago, because they don't care. I find that sometimes the public doesn't want to remember things like that, because this was a very sensational case a long time ago. It really was. It was the number one. I remember when the Denver Post was around, it was the number one case, or number one story that they covered. So it was very, very big deal. And because of that, and because I reviewed the waste stream identification and characterization report, and that was submitted under a consent decree by the Colorado Department of Health and the Department of Energy, and Rockwell at Rocky Flats tried to comply with that consent decree, and basically under oath, they provided this 29-volume document that I reviewed, and I found that the processes of the plant either went into the air, ventilation or incineration, or they went into the water, the sanitary system. And that sanitary system then deposited out to a pond. And there were a lot of regulatory issues that need some explaining, but basically the plant was a zero, I forget the vernacular for it, but they were a zero discharger. In other words, Rockwell's told the health department and the EPA, we don't discharge off-site. And they were liars. In fact, they pled guilty under criminal charges to causing sheet flow runoff from their spray irrigation. Now, looking this thing over, I think there's two things I could say. Plausible deniability, because the actors have changed, and whether they have looked at the historical nature of the site. And secondly, it is up to the people to make a decision.
Yeah.
But I do believe that they should be informed, and that's the whole point of why I rode hard to get here.
In your opinion, is there any area of Rocky Flats that could be considered safe?
I don't know that I can address that intelligently, because I don't know exactly what cleanup standards were involved. Like I said about the strontium and the cesium, I haven't seen that they were looking for it, so I guess it was guesswork whether they were going to get it or not. But we were dealing with a a group of government employees and a contractor who lied and deceived the citizens and the government here in Colorado. And even after they got caught, Rockwell put many times a full-page ad that they didn't do anything wrong. Well, they did do something wrong. And that's the whole point about the infrared video, is that I guess I need to get into a little particularity here, is the sewage treatment plant was the focus point of all of the liquid waste. And it was allowed to go to Pond B3 on South Walnut Creek. Pond B3 then was allowed to spray irrigate only under certain conditions. Well, on December 15th, 1988, at 10 o'clock at night, and I don't remember the temperature, but it was well below freezing, is not the time to spray irrigate. It caused sheet runoff that you can see is thermally active. It's over by the old 903 pad. That's a burial site for uranium. And all of that water, if you want to call it that liquid, that cocktail, sheet runoff, some of it, of course, would be absorbed, possibly. But it went down to Woman Creek. It went to C1, to C2, and then it went out to Stanley. And then the 207 CAB ponds, which were under a closure order, they were not to be operated. They were thermally active. They were known leakers. It leaked over to the A1 pond, which is on the unnamed tributary to North Walnut Creek. And then you've got B3 overflowing to B5 and overflowing along Indiana over to Great Western Reservoir, which I understand now is no longer a drinking water supply for the city of Bloomfield. I wonder why. Now, if they want to operate in that kind of a vacuum and be ignorant about telling people why they're not doing something, I think is bad government, and that's not what this country stands for. And I will yell to the top of my lungs that they're wrong, and I'll say it to their face.
My second question is kind of a follow-up to that. Mark Udo has been quoted recently as saying that Rocky Flats is a pristine wildlife refuge now. Any thoughts, given your background and experience with Rocky Flats, as to the veracity of that statement?
What does he mean by pristine?
Well, I guess that would be all relative. But I think clean.
Up in Alaska, the vines, in the pristine areas are so thick that you really can't walk it, and the trees are really old. And I've talked to people that know what they're talking about bringing back an area that's been logged. It takes 300 years to make it pristine again. So I don't understand it. I don't know what horticultural degree he has, and I don't know who his experts are, but the ones that I've talked to, there's no way it could be pristine, because I'm also going to say that I'm not sure that it was cleaned up appropriately for life to even be out there. And it's all a snow job, and I don't mean to be saying a pun in the middle of winter, but it's just not right. I don't agree.
And obviously, your investigation had probably some professional fallout. How much longer did you stay with the FBI?
Oh, I retired. It wasn't easy. I was exiled by Mike Norton. He went into the special agent in charge of Denver office, and I know this on good authority that he told the SAC that I needed to be transferred out of Denver, and I was transferred to Los Angeles to a street gang squad, a mile away from ground zero of the Rodney King riots. Popcorn was not the usual thing I heard out there. It was gunfire where I worked. And the financial and psychological violence that was imposed on my family was part of the transfer for not taking the company line and lying in front of Congress. And, I wasn't so worried about myself because I was a trained police officer. And there's two sides to this. Number one, I'd already gotten my orders. And I need to tell you this, that in December of 1992, I felt like things were going south for me. And I asked my supervisor in the front office, what's the chances of me getting transferred? And they said, none. There's no money. Here it was 2 months into the new fiscal year, and there was no money for transfers. But they found the money to transfer me in January of 93. And in March of 93, I had a lead out in South Central LA, and the agent in LA told me, well, the agents in LA weren't allowed to go to South Central because of the Rodney King riots. But yet I was being transferred out to South Central LA. And I don't mean to cast any aspersions on the demography there in South Central at the time. I had worked all different parts of Las Vegas. I got along with everybody: black, white, brown, yellow, red. Didn't matter to me. But to have what happened to hurt my family is what drove me to just hang in there, and I did. And I have a very supportive wife, and she's here with me, and I don't mind coming out and doing stuff like this. I don't. If somebody will give me a chance to answer some questions about how I feel about this, then I'll tell them, and maybe even give them a book so they can understand it better. But it ruined my career. I wasn't promotable anymore, and really.
You basically became a liability.
Oh, I would never worked environmental crimes again. I went from working probably, I should probably leave the modesty at the doorstep. I was probably in the top 3 in the country as far as environmental crimes investigative expertise. I spoke before Department of Justice groups and went back to the academy and did training and things like that. All that went away. So then I worked street gangs in South Central, RICO cases and things like that. But I try to have fun with whatever I do. And I had always wanted to be an FBI agent, and that's why my wife named my company Mission Accomplished Investigations, because I got it done. Judy brought up a good point about our retirement. I worry about that. I don't know. Should I talk about the cook thing at all?
Sure.
In 2004, in March of 2004, actually, let's go back to February. I knew the book was coming out, Ambush Grand Jury. So I wrote a letter to the director, Robert Mueller, and explained to him that I'd sent a letter to Congress, that I cooperated with Wes and Karen Balcony about the Ambush Grand Jury. And I also reminded him of his duty not to take out revenge on whistleblowers, because the FBI has a sorry record as far as protecting whistleblowers. I mean, look what happened to Colleen Raleigh and I speak. Colleen Raleigh was the legal counsel up in Milwaukee on the Moussaoui case, the 9/11 case. And she wrote letters and communications to headquarters, went on deaf ears, so she wrote to Congress, and she became the one of the Time Women of the Year. And, we both are very thankful that we were able to retire, because there's too many that, and I believe I'm a whistleblower, other whistleblowers weren't so accommodated. They were mistreated, and they lost their livelihood and things like that. So the book came out in March of 2004. I came to Denver in August of 2004 to do a press conference on my own time. I was called up and told I couldn't talk. I don't know if you remember that. Basically told the press what I came here to say I can't say. It was ridiculous. So where I was driving it was that promotional opportunity came up, and it was made clear to me that I was not going to be considered for it. In fact, I was going to be transferred from a very good position that I had. I don't know what. And I can go on and on about a bunch of things that had happened over the years. I told my wife, I said, I just don't think there's, I was 50 years old, I could retire, might as well just do it. She goes, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know, I guess I'll go take the private investigative license exam. And so I applied in September and took it in October, and luckily I passed it on the first run. It takes 3 times usually. And then I became an entrepreneur, just like overnight. I retired, and then all of a sudden, and I had colleagues call me up and say, well, what's it like? I said, you know what, it's neat. He says, what do you mean? I said, well, don't you look back? I said, no, I only looked back one time. And I wrote my first report, because we were used to having a proving official, and I realized I was the proving official. So I just laid it on my desk and came back and reread it and then approved it. And that's the only time I've ever looked back. I mean, it's just been great.
Do you really sit at a desk and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes all the time?
Don't smoke. And I don't drink that much coffee. I've had more coffee today than...
When you came back to that original press conference, you said that you had been told not to speak and that you had something to say at that time but had been told not to.
Yeah.
What would that have been, if you're at liberty to share that with us now?
Well, I would tell you if I could remember exactly, but it was the book had come out, and I can't remember if you were in office at the time. Not yet.
We were. That was when the election was held in November. I won that election.
Yeah.
So we did.
I think it was just part of the ongoing. The premise for getting involved was not to bang the drum. I move on. Is my psyche. But when I looked at what I knew, and I also knew that. Trying to remember her name. Gosh, she was a great congresswoman here in Colorado.
Pat Schroeder?
Pat Schroeder. Wore the American flag. Got in trouble. Why, I don't know. And she was considering what the cleanup costs would be, and it was in the trillions, and it would take decades and decades and decades. And then all of a sudden I heard that Rocky Flats was getting cleaned up super fast, and there were some questionable things. And so the manuscript, the whole idea, the concept was that we needed to get the word out that this, I don't know who Mark Udall is. I know that he was a congressman from here. And he's got a cousin down in New Mexico that I think was a senator. And I have no idea why he decided that this would be a great place to turn into a wildlife refuge and allow kids to come and picnic. But my feeling was that it was incomplete data was being considered for the cleanup. So how can they do a cleanup? I mean, a cleanup means that you know what you're looking for and you mop it up and make it better than what it was. And to top it off, now we're hearing, I read the site that they want to make visitor use facilities for people to come in and decide when they want to lay their blanket down. And I think that people should know what they're in for, because you don't want history to repeat itself. I've read quite a bit of material that this is a cookie cutter situation for the rest of the nuclear weapons complex. And how many nuclear plants do we have in the country? Which I believe is the reason why we have nuclear plants, power plants, is to feed the military weaponry. That's where the plutonium is made on the pile.
So, yes, that was Mr. John Lipsky, I believe his name is. He was a former FBI agent that was on the case that got the FBI involved the only time that he knows of with actual another executive branch, one branch going after the other. The FBI went after the Department of Energy, I believe, in that case. So, good for him. And I'm going to be very fortunate to have him on my show, and I'll be able to ask him some more technical questions about the plant. He is maybe one of the only experts left that really understands what was going on out there and how they were working and what they were doing. I'm going to give us just a bit of an overview of some of the leakage that occurred over the years. Keep in mind that this is talcum powder, fine dust. If anybody watched or listened to the Judy Padilla interview, then you heard her say it's fine dust. It's like talcum powder. How do you contain talcum powder? That much of it, all over the place. Every process creates a little. They lost over 100 pounds. The guy even said, yeah, the people out there are like, I'm sorry, we can't operate this plant legally. It just can't be done. Yet we're in process, i.e. we have plugs and this and that. The whole process has to go through before we can shut each part down. And in the process, there's going to be more leakage. And don't look over there. Here, put on this blindfold. When we're going through this part, okay, now don't look. This is the kind of thinking we're having here, folks, and between one government agency and another. So, as a result of that, they did lose over 100 pounds of this talcum powder dust. So, Wikipedia says that the Rocky Flats plant is a former nuclear weapons production facility located 15 miles northwest of Denver, which is where I grew up, and it caused radioactive, primarily plutonium, americium, and uranium contamination within and outside its boundaries. Also, you can add to that, obviously they had some fissioning events that go on there, briefly at least, so you can add strontium-90 and other nasties to that. The whole fission process creates that. Even the filters burned up at one point. It was really terrible. So, the contamination primarily resulted from 2 plutonium fires in 1957 and then again in 1969. Plutonium is pyrophoric, and shavings of it can spontaneously combust, and from windblown to plutonium that leaked from barrels also of radioactive waste. Much lower concentrations in those were released throughout the operational life of the plant from 1952 to 1942. From smaller accidents and from normal operational releases of plutonium particles too small to be filtered. Prevailing winds from the plant carried on airborne contamination south and east into populated areas of northwest Denver, and that's basically where I grew up. Contamination of the Denver area by plutonium from the fires and other sources was not publicly reported until the 1970s. According to a 1972 study co-authored by Edward Martell in the more densely populated regions of Denver, the plutonium contamination levels in surface soils is several times fallout, and the plutonium contamination just east of the plant ranges from hundreds of times that to that which would be left over from a nuclear test. As noted by Charles Johnson in Ambio, exposures of large populations in the Denver area to plutonium and other radionuclides in the exhaust plumes from the plant. They date back to 1953. Weapons production at the plant was halted in 1989, and this person that you just listened to was one of the team members that got that done. They started cleanup And in 1989, 1992, during the 1990s, they started decommissioning, and by 2012 to 2013, they finished disassembly of the plant and what they called cleanup. What they called cleanup was they scraped up a couple inches of soil and buried the rest in some new soil, and it was sloppily at that. Go to some Google Earth images. If you put Rocky Flats in, you'll get it. And look, and use the timeline feature and go back to, you can go all the way back to when the plant was still there, and you can watch them decommission it. And it's like, it takes about a year, and between 2012 and 2013 for that plant to just poof, disappear, and then nothing changes after that. There's no further remediation. I don't see any big moving of soil. It's just desert now. It's like they scraped up a little right around the plants, and then they just buried it and left it in the wind. In 2017, the Colorado Department CDPHE. How do you expect me to know what that is, folks? It's a cancer registry that says that it looked at the incidence of thyroid and all rare cancers around Rocky Flats and showed no evidence of higher than expected thyroid cancer. However, the supplement did identify a statistically higher rate of pancreatic cancer in men in Wheat Ridge. So let's see, sources of contamination. Most of the radioactive contamination from Rocky Flats came from three sources: a catastrophic fire in 1957, leaking barrels in an outdoor storage area in 1964 through 1968, and then another less severe fire in 1969. Plutonium used to construct the weapon's fissile components can spontaneously combust at room temperatures in air. Additional sources of actinide contamination, including inadequate concrete vitrification attempts and routine releases during the maintenance operations of the plant. I'm going to close with this. On the evening of September 11th, 1957, plutonium shavings in a glove box in Building 771, and they called that the Plutonium Recovery and Fabrication Facility, spontaneously combusted. The fire spread to the flammable glove boxes, including to the plexiglass windows and rubber gloves. The fire spread rapidly through all of the interconnected boxes and ignited a large bank of high-efficiency HEPA filters located in a Plinian downstream. Within minutes, the first filters had burned out, allowing all the plutonium particles to escape from the building exhaust stacks. Building exhaust fans stopped operating due to fire damage finally at 10:40 p.m., which ended the majority of the plutonium release. Firefighters initially used carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, but those proved inadequate due to the hugeness of the fire, and so they had to use water. So we'll pick up there tomorrow, folks. Thank you, UCY.TV, and I hope everybody has a great day. And my name is Jerome. I am the Sane Environmentalist. Go check me out on YouTube.